Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to another episode of the Realist Lens for researchers who keep it real. One of the most important things academia must do is become more accessible, not just for new researchers, but also for the communities we aim to serve. It's not enough for our work to sit on university library shelves or be tucked away in academic databases. To truly make an impact, we need to ensure our research reaches a wider audience in ways that are understandable and meaningful. Realist evaluation and realist synthesis offer powerful ways of thinking about the social world, but these approaches often come wrapped in complex jargon and dense academic language. That makes it hard for people to engage with them, whether it's knowing how to apply these approaches, interpret findings, or translate insights into real world value. That's exactly why I started the Realist Lens to help bridge that gap. But how do we do this further? How can we make realist research more accessible? How do we stay true to its complexity while making it relevant and useful to a broader range of people? Our guest today is a brilliant example of how to just do that. An advocate for accessibility and a champion of realist approaches, Kev Harris is here to share insights on making complex ideas work in everyday life. Absolute pleasure to have you in, Kev. Good morning. How are you?
I'm very good, thank you, Alejandro. Thank you so much for inviting me along, and thank you for calling me a champion as well. Really
Well,
appreciate it.
not at all. I've seen your work and everything that you do, not only through your published work, but also with the training that you do for the UK Evaluation Society, and also all the other projects that you're involved in. And everything that you do is exactly with that lens in mind of accessibility and making all this way of thinking just for
Mm,
everyone rather than for some. So I love that. But
thank
just
you.
before we get started into the topic of today, Kev, would you mind just sharing a little bit more about yourself and your background and some of the projects that you're involved in at the moment?
Yeah, thank you, Alejandro. Essentially, I suppose my background is one where I was formerly a practitioner, so someone working in the field of social innovation, social change, in particular within the area of sport and physical activity. So, the various types of projects or interventions or programs of trying to encourage people to be more physically active, and this idea that sport and physical activity can do good, it can change people's lives and all those sorts of things. So I was very much sort of like driven with a passion for sport and physical activity in particular in terms of what it could do, and that was very much part of my sort of like the way I saw the world, and that my immediate sort of point of departure was, right, this is going to do good for people and everything. But I was always kind of like critically conscious about that. I'm like, really, is that really happening? Even though I was sort of like just doing it kind of thing. And that's where I moved into continuing my academic journey. For example, particularly it was when I was at my first institution teaching students about sport and physical activity, social change, and all those sorts of things, that I decided that I wanted to embark upon my PhD. So I was teaching at the time whilst I started my PhD. And I remember sitting down with potential supervisors at the time, and they were like, "Well, what do you want to do then?" I was like, "Well, I'd really like to understand how practitioners in the field of that particular area, sport for development, sport for social change, navigate evidence, and why do they evidence things in the way that they do." And it was that particular time that I kind of realized that a lot of the evidence that was there was not necessarily comprehensive, and it was very much like this the silver bullet, tell me that this works, tell me that that works, that legitimacy. And sort of like went on from there in terms of exploring my PhD, working with practitioners to try and look at how can realist evaluation or realist thinking help people to make more sense of what goes on. And ever since then, it's sort of like that's taken me onto this journey of realist evaluation and realist informed research, for example, has really changed my outlook on how I see the world, but also how I see these types of interventions and projects, whole systems thinking, for example, really manifesting itself. And where I am now is I'm very happy to be working very closely with Sport England on a huge piece of work focused on tackling structural inequalities that people face through physical activity. So working very closely with them, essentially around helping places to understand the impact of their work around whole systems, place-based approaches to physical activity. And there's a couple other bits that surround that as well, but very much at the forefront of working with people in that kind of like real setting, if that makes sense.
It makes absolute sense, Kevin, and I love that layered approach that you're talking about from all these different angles and experiences that you're saying. So education, sports, coaching, applied practice that now has developed your journey into using realist approaches. And I would like to talk a little bit more as well at some point around how you've gone and even developed some of your own approaches like ripple effects mapping, etc., which I'd like to talk about. You mentioned that during your PhD, you looked at the evidence, and it was very much, does it work or not, or trying to find the solution to these problems. But then you come across realist evaluation, realist synthesis, realist thinking, as I like to say. And I always look at it as a way of thinking, as a way of seeing the social world. Can you share what was it that made them resonate with you for your approach to real world problem solving and what you were seeing in the ground as a practitioner? What was it that resonated with you from the approaches?
I think the key thing that kind of resonated with me at the time is that in a lot of the work that I was involved in, people were talking about theories of change, and they were talking about, as we know, theories of change is a very nebulous term. It means different things to different people and all those sorts of things. And for me, I was coming across the logic model a lot, which is very much useful tool to kind of understand the architecture of what is going on. However, it's kind of like very sort of like successionist in terms of A plus B equals C. There's kind of linearity and all that sort of stuff. And I was slightly uncomfortable with that because through my own experience and lived experience of working in the field, being a sports coach a long time ago, working with young people, actually being there, I'd love to have like kind of written a letter to my younger self to say, God, well, wish I'd have looked at things slightly different then. And I was like, well, I have an opportunity now to kind of have a small role, if I can, in shaping the future of my students, for example, to get them to think about how they look at the impact of their work far more critically. And that is where I remember being sat down with Professor Stephen Henderson, who was my director of studies at the time. And he basically just said to me, Kev, you want to look at and understand evidence and start to, go deeper. Realist evaluation is going to be the one for you. So a little bit like lots of people who've been through this journey, there is always an introduction. And that was the introduction to it for me, where I was like, I want to know more. I want to go deeper. I'd love to understand, well, what is it about sports interventions or physical activity and all these sorts of things that does something for people, that does something for communities? How can we start to explain how and why those things happen? And as we know, the realist evaluation approach was something that just ticked all of the boxes in that respect. That's not to say that I found it immediately easy. It is like, oh my God, what is this? I mean, the word realist itself, it's almost like, when you talk to your kids, when I talk to my children about, right, you need to eat your vegetables, sometimes it just switches them off. And I found that many a times, which is why, the word realist in itself, because of its philosophical connotations and implications, can be kind of like a little bit of a sideliner for some people. So I very much experienced that, and then made some of the mistakes of delving into the philosophical foundations, which we know in your other podcast, Ferdy is saying, don't go too deep too soon in relation to that. So yeah, to answer your question in a long-winded way, I would absolutely say that it was the ability of the realist approach to really go beneath the surface and tell us how, why, and for whom things are working. And in particular, the contextual piece, context being key. I think that's one of the distinguishing things about the realist approach, is that lots of theory of change approaches go beneath the surface and do the how and why they claim to. But what really gets a realist thing to stand out for me is that element of context, which, Ray and Nick and so many other people like Anna have really sort of like pushed on with. Because again, within the field that I was working with, and still the same now, there's this idea of, okay, if we deliver this physical activity project here in this place, it's going to have the same impact over here. And everyone's looking for this generalizability. They're looking for this, okay, let's do this treatment here. If it's going to work, wow, let's roll this thing out. But we know that how one thing works in one area will depend because of because of the locality, because of all of those contextual circumstances that surround it. So that was the key eureka moment for me. And I was like, wow, I wish I'd have had this 10 years ago, for example.
I love that, Kev, how you've gone through all those details of a journey, what it sounds like, of discovery and of then of realization, of light bulb moments, and also of probably just looking at the frustrations that you had at the time. Because I think a lot of people come to Realist for various reasons, but one of them seems to be that people are frustrated with the status quo in a way of how people view the world of like, X equals Y. And if we put an intervention here. And you don't have to go too far. I mean, you say, the work you're doing in Sports England, even within the same city or the same borough, all these interventions can change depending on the context. For instance,
Mm,
in London, it's not the same that say you do something in north or east or south. It doesn't
mm.
have to change country at all. So that is really interesting. And you mentioned something there that I want to touch upon because it really links to the topic of today around accessibility, because you mentioned around the role that you want to give to your students, and giving them a way of thinking and being critical about their work and the impact that it does. And I guess that as a practitioner and a realist researcher, you're also trying to make these concepts more accessible, not only to your students, but also, for example, the stakeholders you may working in Sports England or with PPI involvement or with anyone that's being involved in your
Mm.
projects and realist work. And it is true that it can often feel complex or intimidating. You said yourself that even the word realist itself and going into all the philosophy can feel a little bit daunting. So, how have you gone about translating these realist ideas and approaches to something more accessible for practitioners, coaches, educators, or students? What has been your process to do that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think in terms of sort of like continuing the story, I was very fortunate enough at the time at my first institution, Solent University, to be able to use a curriculum to test the realist methodology with practitioners, with students, in particular with the students, where I found myself teaching them about, the traditional realist evaluation process, develop program theories, test them, refine them for learning and action, all that sort of stuff. I was very fortunate to be able to play around with it and experiment with the realist process. But one of the things that I soon found is not just with students, but with everyone, is like I was like encouraging students to develop context mechanisms and outcomes. Now, it made sense to me, but it was only after lots of reading and everything. I'm like, well, how do I expect that to land immediately with people? And I'm like, well, things like CMMOs and the different iterations of it, no disrespect, they're absolutely important. They're really important heuristics and frameworks for us to start to build that realist logic and that kind of sense making, I suppose. But for me, I was finding that a huge barrier for a lot of people around realist evaluation, particularly the very people that we want to influence or we want to encourage to, you know, dive into those murky waters of, how and why and all those sorts of things. The language and the jargon, very academic, very hard for certain people to get their heads around. Like, if you could sort of like come up with a realist bingo game and you've got things like context mechanism, resource mechanism, reasoning, outcome, what's that? You've got demi-regularities, you've got retroduction, you've got the logic of abduction, deduction, all of the other stuff, and and it's like mid-range theories. The list goes on, and to people in the real world, and even though my former supervisor would have said to me, Kev, we're all living in the real world. There is no external universe. We're all in the real world here. I'm like, but there is a different world that people occupy in terms of those different contexts. So people are after more sort of like plain speaking and more sort of like real language that they can make sense with. So it's almost like, well, that's an embarkation then into, right, well, the first port of call is, which is what we do now in a lot of the work with places across the country and I do in my training, is that we always start off with, tell me that you're not a realist. Everyone is a realist at heart, because I always say to people, do you ever go through your day where you find that you don't have to explain yourself to somebody, whether it's to your boss, your line manager, to your wife, to your husband, to your children. Tell me that that never happens, and no one's ever able to say no, it doesn't happen. We're always explaining what we're doing. We're always explaining why we're doing it. It's always underpinned by the circumstances that we're in at the moment, financial, social, all those sorts of things. And then you find little ways then of kind of thinking about how can we start to spread that kind of realist love in a contextual way that makes sense to people. So, for me, I spend a lot of my time working with students in sports coaching and sports management and all that sort of stuff. So the common bond there is sport, it's football, for example. So it's like, how come a manager who did really well at a former club get into that club and do really well, but when he went into a club that was in a very similar situation, relegation 4 years later, and it didn't work? Well, it's something about context there, isn't it, that's explaining it. Why does VAR, for example, not work so well in football compared to other sports like tennis and rugby and cricket and all that sort of stuff? Well, it's because of the context, and it's because of the different behaviors that people have based on that particular sporting culture, for example. And that's where you start to see the sort of like, oh, right, okay, yeah. So we do this stuff all the time. So that's where we come through and say, right, well, why can't we start to think about our evidence in our projects and our programs and our systems, for example, in the same way? And people are like, and that's where you start to open the door and you get a little bit of the buy-in, if that makes sense.
Absolutely, Kev. I love that example that you're giving there, which is making realist thinking just align and to be relevant to their own world, as you say, and having that audience very clear in who you're speaking to. Because as you say, if you have sports students, you can definitely think of examples of sporting examples. And if you're talking to a stakeholder PPI group in a project around inequalities, for instance, you were talking around reducing sport inequalities, you can start there as well and go from there. Certainly, it's not as you mentioned, if you start into going into the philosophy too quickly or into some of the other areas, it can be very complex very quickly, and people switch off by then because it doesn't feel like it relates to them in that way, right? And then if you put it into the real life perspective, and that's a different story. You've mentioned just now as well and some of the barriers that people have when understanding realist evaluation or realist synthesis, realist research, realist thinking. I'm interested to see from your experience what the biggest barriers have been for that initial accessibility. You mentioned a lot of these terms, but do you feel there's anything in particular that people really struggle with that as a community of practice we should really be looking to help to make more accessible? So for instance, is it the fact that people really struggle with the philosophical parts. They struggle
Mm,
with the theory building. They struggled
mm.
with the CMO configuration. Is there anything specific that you found students really struggle to grasp?
Yeah, I think it's a brilliant question. I think it's kind of like with a lot of the people who work within complex health interventions, or people who are sort of like tasked with solving these real complex issues through practice, practitioners, people, and they're fantastic at it. They're brilliant at doing it. They've got the skill sets. But one of the things that I found is that there isn't a huge, this is outside of realist evaluation, by the way, is that one of the things that I found, and I could be wrong based on my limited life experience that I have of living in the UK, is that there isn't a huge amount of capacity and capability training out there for people in general monitoring and evaluation, or monitoring, evaluation and learning. So students come through, higher education, undergraduate degrees, masters, and seldom do you see specific modules that are set up to help people to do evaluation and learning. And then they find themselves in job interviews or in jobs where they're being asked and tasked to identify evidence that is and outcomes and mobilize evaluation approaches that they just haven't had any training in, for example. So that foundational sort of like exercise of being familiar and having some consciousness around evidence and critiquing the work that they're involved in, and thinking about, right, I've got this toolkit here. I could use realist evaluation, or I could use a different method of evaluation, for example. I think that there's some work to do in relation to that, especially where, lots of people will come through a degree, a master's, and even through PhD, mainly sort of like, it's about research methodology. But we know that whilst research and evaluation share very similarities. Research and evaluation has many distinctions as well. So that's the first point. And then as as a result of that, you then try and introduce something to someone that is very complex. It's sort of like riddled with the jargon. You want to give them a really accessible paper to read, but still you'd read that paper requires someone to read 14 pages, and it will have philosophy in it. It will have something about CMMO in it. It'll have something about the word program theory in itself. You know, the word, I would say the word theory scares some people. So, you know, that has been sort of like a huge barrier for people. So those are some of the things. And then when you want to sort of like give people the control and the opportunity to actually be part of doing it as well, you say, right, here's a realist interview. Go out and do a realist interview, please. I mean, how on earth do I do that? So there are lots of solutions to this, which obviously, or ways forward that, you know, that we're starting to explore. But those are some of those barriers. And then that's also exacerbated by the fact of what is the evidence that actually means something to people at the end. So the policymakers, you know, I find myself in conversations a lot where people are like, right, all this explanatory depth that's coming from this realist evaluation and the how and the why, the contextual stuff, I've only got half an hour with someone from the Department of Health, or I've only got 20 minutes, and they want this an answer on a postcard, or they want this, you know, on an A4 piece of paper. What are the key headline findings? So at some point you go through all of that richness, and then at the end there is still the request for that dilution, if that makes sense. And that for me is kind of like, I'd probably say there's three layers to that challenge of trying to sort of like encourage people to engage with it, I suppose.
That's so interesting that you mentioned the kind of like the difference there between the research and then what the policymakers and decision makers want, or even fund in a way as well. Some of the funding as well. I know that in the UK now, realist evaluation synthesis approaches are, you know, the funding is becoming much more available. But even when it comes to the other end of the decision, you have the realist slogan or logo, which is "it depends." And clearly, for a policymaker or a decision maker, that decision is not sometimes what they want to hear. As they
Mm.
want really clear
Mm.
evidence into what works. So that is certainly a challenge that we can as a community see how it can develop. And I know there's answers to it, but it's harder to turn someone into a realist without having that initial understanding of what realist thinking involves. Particularly, as you say, if you only have 20, 30 minutes, I think this is where the accessibility becomes so important. If you can
Mm.
explain to someone the realist approach in 5 minutes and within that meeting, so then when the evidence is being presented, it makes sense within that, then that could be so powerful.
Absolutely. And in terms of, you know, moving it forward and starting to explore how things are advancing, there are lots of positives that sort of like, you know, are going on. I mean, I would say that, for example, with when you've got a commissioner or you've got someone who wants to fund an evaluation and they've got a big question that they want to ask of, does this thing work? I suppose a realist evaluation can tell you what the outcomes are. It can tell you if this thing works or not, but it can give you, you know, I say, wouldn't it be nice for us to be able to say, this is why it works? Wouldn't you like to know how it works so that you can really start to move on? Because people would be like, yeah, tell me that it works, but what learning is there for you to move forward with? In terms of, right, we know that this works because there's something about listening and responding that's taken place here within the community. There's something about working in a place-based way in terms of drawing upon the assets. So therefore, that whole idea of refinement is not just sitting there with this set of refined program theories, for example, or explanatory statements for how and why this thing works based on different contextual factors, but there's something there that enables people to make informed decisions moving forward to carry on doing good work, or perhaps in most cases, it's about refining and adapting and thinking about, okay, how can we start to continue to evolve the work based on this explanatory evidence that we have? And I think, you know, changing the word theory, you know, replacing the word theories, you know, to things like what are your ideas, what are the ideas that you have, what are the assumptions and beliefs, what are some of the explanations behind this thinking that you have in terms of this outcome that you wish to see and why? And then that's where I think the realist community, which is another one of the big selling points for me, by the way, when I sort of, moved into it, is that I've never met anyone in the realist community who has been a huge gatekeeper. As in, like, it's always been inclusive. It's been such a fantastic environment where, that whole idea of being methods neutral, I've not met any resistance from anyone. And I think that's one of the great things about realist evaluation is that it's open to innovation, but it's open to innovation in a real equitable way where, it's everyone feels kind of part of it essentially.
I love that, Kevin. I think a great example of that is the Ramsey's mailing list,
Yes.
right? That
Yeah,
people
yeah.
go through, that people constantly ask questions, people share things, people share papers, ideas. There's great debates. And I think, as you say, it's such an inclusive community of practice, which I think that for many people, they can't probably say the same. So it's really appreciated. And you've mentioned already one of the things there, some of the strategies that you use. So, for example, moving from theory to an explanation, or the hunches or the assumptions that you're having around this phenomena or program, which is really interesting. I wonder if you can touch upon some of the other strategies that you've used, because I know that in our previous conversations, you've used things such as, for example, if-then statements to do those initial explanations, or also how and why conversations to
Hmm.
when it comes to realist interviews. And I think those two things are so important within as well the ripple effects mapping that you have been developing. So I wonder for listeners if you could explain a little bit more around that specific approach and how, again, I think how accessible it is because how it's so collaborative with the
Mm.
stakeholders and how you're trying to get everyone in, and then
Yeah.
how you've used those strategies of if then and how and why to try and make realist work more accessible.
Yeah, absolutely. So, but one of the big starting points in all of the evaluation that I do, and the evaluation work that we're involved in across the country is very much about this idea of being equitable, this idea of collaboration. Um, Evaluation in itself can be very much a transactional endeavor where you're a university or you're a consultancy and you're tasked and you're commissioned because of your credibility to go out and develop this evidence and report it back through a lovely report that, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But the question is, where does it go? And whose views does this work kind of represent and who's involved in it and who owns it? So, and then you bring that sort of like that realist sort of like element, that realist piece into it. And then you're like, well, okay, well, how can we encourage more people to be involved in that actual journey? So that journey is not just one of sitting down and so-called co-producing program theories with communities or groups and all those sorts of things, but what does that really mean and how they resourced, how do they become involved? And that's one thing, but then how can you then, I don't like to use the word empower, but how can you give them then control to then move forward and actually be involved in testing, these theories or these assumptions and beliefs and these if then because statements that are coming out. And then that's where the buy-in is there potentially to then lead into that kind of refinement piece and what people do with that learning moving forward. So the if then because statement, which is something that's been used by loads of people, is a really nice way to kind of identify a program theory, and you can very easily build that into a CMMO configuration as well, is a great way of doing it. Um, Different ways of developing what we call explanatory statements in some of our place work is a way that we do that as well. And just giving the people the opportunity to really sort of like just write things out. Sometimes just writing things out in a how and why. When you say something, can you explain how and why that works, and just speak it? You can record it or then write it out. You're not necessarily giving someone a formula, they kind of follow it anyway. And then in terms of some of like the ways of testing and exploring this sort of stuff, you can use obviously lots of different methods to do so. But one of the things that we've been doing quite a lot across the country is mobilizing what we call the how and why conversation. So the how and why conversation essentially believes in and it celebrates the great work that Anna Manzano has done in terms of developing the realist interview, because we know we needed that guidance, because a lot of people doing realist evaluations in the past could be very easily falling into that kind of constructivist lens of tell me what your view of the world is, rather than can I present these ideas to you and see what you think about it. So instead of working with practitioners in a project or a program and saying to them, right, would you like to be involved in doing these realist interviews with us? Well, instead, could we give you some training around light touch realist evaluation? And can we give you some training around the how and why conversation, which is another form of the realist interview? Instead of using the word realist interview, we're using how and why conversation so that people can go out and basically just explore and test these ideas that they have about their projects or their programs and the different ways in which they see things working, and basically just presenting them to people. Look, I'll show you mine if you show me yours, that sort of thing. So you're still staying true to the philosophical endeavor of what the realist interview requires, but you're calling it something else. You're calling it a how and why conversation. And as a result, we're starting to pull together these different communities of practices that are like how and why hubs and places where people are thinking about that explanatory depth. And then again, you mentioned ripple effects mapping. I mean, ripple effects mapping is one of the most popular methods out there at the minute that people are really interested in, around this idea of, using a timeline, getting people together in a collaborative, participatory way to identify the key impacts that they're seeing across their work. And then thinking about, okay, well, what does that lead to? What are the kind of like the different ripples that come out of that, for example? But we know from a realist perspective, it's a good method, but it's very pragmatic. It's very pragmatist. So we've used ripple effects mapping to kind of try and align it with the realist evaluation approach. And as a result, we published a paper recently which talks about realist informed ripple effects mapping, where we use the ripple effects mapping process to identify what we call causal connections. So usually people will use post-it notes, but it's like, well, wouldn't it be lovely to pull that post-it note back and look underneath and see, well, why did that impact come about? And then that's where you can start to use other really interesting methods of innovation, like stories of change, and then the how and why conversations, but also surveys, different quals and quants based approaches to start to kind of dig beneath the surface in relation to it. So those are some of the ways in which that realist kind of thread can continue to manifest itself in people's ways of thinking.
It absolutely can. And there's something that you've said there that has really, really struck me. And I was thinking, which is just the importance of language when it comes to what you've mentioned, the realist interview or a how and why conversation. Because an interview, if you're getting, say, a participant or a stakeholder at PPI, it always feels like the power dynamic, right? Of like, I am here to get information, even though I know that's not the intended purpose at all of a realist interview. It's very much a teacher learner cycle, but even just position it as a how and why conversation rather than an interview,
Yes.
people from the start, they probably feel a little bit more at ease. It's a two-way process in that way.
Absolutely, and just to come in on that really quickly, I completely agree. And the reason, and when if you say to someone, "Can I interview you?" Immediately there's a dynamic there that it's like, yeah, there's that immediate dynamic of it's transactional. You want something from me, whereas when you call it a conversation, it's more mutual. It's more kind of like that knowledge translation, or that sort of like it's far more interactive. And I think as researchers and evaluators, the majority of the thing that we need is data. We need data. So when you're commissioned to do evaluation, and if it's a complex area, or if it's an area of inequality, or it's an area of deprivation, where people are really hard to reach, there are huge challenges there for how we get that data. So a realist interview is a way, but in the spirit of this equitable evaluation, where how can we engage more communities in evaluation, or how can we engage more communities in actually informing the insights that we're seeking to find, we need to think more innovatively in terms of how we do that. For me, my vision is that what what wouldn't it be amazing? Wouldn't it be utopia if we could have people from voluntary sector organizations, or people who represent their communities, who know their communities and they know their spaces better than anyone else, and are able to engage with people and tell the stories about how and why things are working far more openly than, Kev Harris from Hartbury University or from, whoever, that is still important. But wouldn't it be great if we have people out there being able to do that? Because a lot of people, I find it's eureka moments where they're like, oh, I thought in order to be involved in the evaluation, I had to have a master's degree or I'd be doing these surveys. I didn't realize that it's okay to present ideas to people or to clarify and explore how and why things are working. So that for me is like what we want to get to, because that gives us more data and it gives us far more richness beyond what we could achieve just ourselves as researchers and academics.
Certainly, data richness, and then it also touches a little bit on the epistemic injustice, right? Of making sure that those evaluations and that research is also being informed by the people who is meant to serve in that sense, and it becomes such a collaborative process that it reaches as one, and as you mentioned, as a community and a real world rather than working in silos in that sense. Um, Kev, I love the work that you're doing and everything that you're trying to do for the realist world, the realist community, and this process of making it more accessible for people in evaluation and research for your students. And this is the last question that I ask guests, and it's probably the hardest one because I'm sure there's more than three. But if I were to ask you for your top three tips of advice that you should say to people listening to this podcast now who may be realist researchers, PhD students, and ones that have been in the field for a long time or just starting, for them to try and when they're presenting their work or when they're involving stakeholders or when they're teaching, to make realist approaches more accessible, to make realist approaches that they can understand straight away. And what would be your top three tips for people to use immediately?
Yeah. Oh, good question, Alejandro. And there'd be probably more than three that I could think of. But I suppose one of the first ones immediately is about building a relationship with the very people that you're going to be working with, because in most cases you're working with people, you're dealing with relationships. So fostering meaningful professional relationships, understanding the dynamics that underpin what people are doing is crucial, because that's where you get them to sort of like buy in. They're like, right, this person coming from this X, Y, and Z understands me, and actually I like them. And it is about relationships. And that's where you have an opportunity to start to sell the realist approach, for example, in that respect. So that developing that mutual understanding and relationship is the first thing I'd say, which is important for any type of research and evaluation. In terms of that kind of realist piece, I would say it's about making it accessible. It's about thinking about, understanding the different power dynamics that you have in terms of the knowledge and the sort of like where you're coming from as a researcher or as an evaluator who will know a fair bit about the methodology, but how can you really make it down to earth and really bring it to life in a way that doesn't undo the the rigor of what realist evaluation and realist informed research is. You can still maintain that whilst just relating it to the context in which they're able to engage with it. So really think about the different ways that you can do that. And then thirdly, be open to innovation. Don't be afraid to um, to challenge different approaches, or don't be afraid to evolve different approaches. I think we've got fantastic PhD candidates out there who are with fantastic supervision from the legends that are out there in realist evaluation, are really sort of like pushing the boundaries here. So don't be afraid to use different methods, qualitative, quantitative methods, to think about ways to really sort of like strengthen that realist contribution. So, I've done it in the past with Q methodology, done it in the past with realist ripple effects mapping. There's lots of, we're doing it within our work in the National Evaluation and Learning Partnership with Sport England through configuration or comparative analysis as well. So there's real room for innovation around it. And I think one of the last thing I would say linked to that is that I think we're very fortunate where we're moving in more of a sort of like an appreciative and strengths based approach to what realist how, realist evaluation sits alongside things like critical realism and all that sort of stuff, where we've come from this sort of like them and us piece. One of 30's most recent papers, Merkenbag's recent papers, sort of like talks about the alignment and looking at, well, what can we do together rather than what can we do apart. So I think really drawing upon that appreciative approach is crucial as well. So I think that's 4 I've given you there, but hopefully you'll let me off.
The more the merrier, Kev, absolutely. And we have, just to summarize those, number one, building a relationship with people. Number two, having that awareness of your position to bring it to life in a way that's useful to people. Number three, be open to innovation. And an extra one for people, if you were waiting for another one, be appreciative.
But there is a 5th one as well, and that would be, I think, a part of that relationships is if evaluation in itself will be meaningful and will do anything, the evidence that we're looking to produce from a piece of work, if it is going to be meaningful, it has to activate what we call that evaluative consciousness. So there has to be the so there has to be that sort of like switch on moment where that people are like, yes, I want to understand complexity, or I really, really want to get into this and I feel part of it, rather than standing in the abstract, a surface learner, sort of like just standing in the background, paying lip service to things. It's when that evaluative consciousness is activated that we can then start to see people taking meaningful actions and decisions that then they will then ripple out and cascade to other people, and they'll advocate for it. So sorry, that's 5 you got from me there.
Thank you so much for your time and for the work that you're doing in this space, because I think it is making a difference and it still will do as you're doing. Good luck with your projects as well with Sports England. I know it's a big one, and all the other things that you're doing. And for anyone else listening, for another episode of the Realist Lens, thank you so much for your time. For hopefully you can take some good inspiration. I think Kev speaks with a lot of passion about the topic, and it's very inspiring to hear his views, some ideas around making research and realist approaches more accessible. And I hope that it's giving you some food for thought. Kev, thank you so much for your time, and I'll speak to you soon.
Thank you.